of the important NCRT chapters. For example, a 20-odd page NCRT chapter would be summarized in 3 to 4 pages, which will be useful for your revision. 3, every Sunday there will be a test, a quiz, a multiple choice question based quiz. And the very next day, next evening, Monday evening, we will have a live discussion of these quizzes by our teachers, followed by a question and answer session, a doubt destroyer session. That's number 1. Number 2, our students who have enrolled with us in either tablet learning program or classroom learning program or live classroom program, they would want to know if they have to attend this program as well, if they have to follow these lectures as well. Well, you can, but when we take classes or conduct classes, whether it is in our tablet learning program or classroom program, we assume that you know nothing. So we start from basics, we start from scratch, so that you don't have to read NCRTs. NCRT based content would be provided in our classes. But if you are studying on your own, or if you have enrolled in a coaching institute which doesn't teach from basics, then this is a very important course for you. Please attend and make the best use of these live sessions. Also, you need to understand that NCRT is not the only source to crack the civil services examination. After you are done with NCRTs, you also need to follow various standard books. For example, Lakshmikant or D.D. Basu for Polity, Bipin Chandra for Modern India, Satish Chandra for Medieval India, so on and so forth, Nitin Singhania for Art and Culture. So NCRT alone cannot help you in cracking this examination. NCRT plus the standard books and then link it with a newspaper. These are the 3 important sources that you will have to follow to qualify this prestigious civil services examination. Let's get started and look at chapter number 1 that we are going to discuss today from 11th Standard NCRT, Indian Constitution at Work, and we will be discussing lecture number 1, which is on executive. So we will understand what is the executive. If you look at, there are 3 organs of the government: legislature, executive, and judiciary. But first thing, since we are starting from scratch, can you tell me what is the difference between a government and the state? Quite often you would be encountering these terms, government and state. What is the difference between the two? State has 4 elements. Any entity, can we call this entity a state? We can if it consists of 4 basic elements. Which are these 4 basic elements? Number 1, people, which means the population. This population should reside in a well-defined territory. This entity should have a government, and this entity should be sovereign. That means independent to take decisions on its own without any influence from a foreign power. This entity, we can call this entity a state if it consists of 4 important elements: population, a well-defined territory, a government, and sovereignty. That means government is one of the important elements of the state. What is a government? Government is one of the elements of a state. And it is this government which is responsible for making laws, implementing laws, and ensuring the welfare of the people. And one of the organs of the state is the executive, something that we are going to discuss today. But legislature, executive, and judiciary, these are the 3 organs of the government. Constitution of India ensures that all these 3 organs work in association with each other, work in collaboration with each other. But very important point, we have a parliamentary form of democracy. The government can be either a presidential government, can be either a parliamentary form of government, where Prime Minister is the head of the government. In case of a presidential form of government, the president is the executive head. In a parliamentary democracy, it is the Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers who basically run the government. So in a parliamentary form of democracy, legislature and executive, they are interdependent on each other. We draw executive from the legislature, which means if you are part of the legislature, you can be part of the executive as well. But most importantly, legislature ensures control over the executive, and in turn, very important statement, executive also controls the legislature. Two important points. One, legislature ensures control over the executive, and executive also controls the legislature. How? Any government, for example, any prime minister and his ministers, will remain in office as long as they have the majority in the Lok Sabha. The moment the government or the prime minister and his council of ministers, they lose majority in Lok Sabha, they will be voted out. They will have to resign. They have no other option but to resign. So legislature keeps a control over the executive. There are various tools which are not mentioned in the NCERT books, but there are various tools through which legislature exercises control over the executive, through various motions, through discussions, through various questions. But when we look at legislature, in a sense, if the government has the majority on the floor of the parliament, the government dictates what kind of laws will be passed in the parliament. The government dictates what kind of issues will be discussed and debated in the parliament. For example, right now we have a government which enjoys majority on the floor of the Lok Sabha. The opposition is crying that we need a discussion on price rise. We need a discussion on these and these many things. But it is the government which decides whether such a discussion can take place or not. So what are we trying to understand today? We are trying to understand executive. And we say legislature, executive, and judiciary. These are three important organs of the government. And what is a government? Government is one of the elements of the state. How can we call an entity a state? A state, an entity can be called a state if it has four important elements. One is population, territory, government, and sovereignty. When we look at a parliamentary form of democracy, such as India, such as United Kingdom, legislature and executive, they are interdependent on each other. In a sense that executive will be in power as long as they have the majority in the legislature. The moment they lose majority, they will have no other option but to resign. But in reality, it is also the executive which keeps a check or which controls the legislature. How? Because if the executive has the majority on the floor of the parliament, it dictates what kind of laws will be passed, what kind of discussion will take place, what kind of issues will be raised inside the legislature. But today, we will focus only on the executive. Legislature, we will discuss some other day. You might also want to know what exactly is executive. In simple language, we say executive means a body of persons, a group of persons who looks after the implementation of rules in actual practice. What does that mean? We have legislature. What is the job of the legislature? In simple terms, the job of the legislature is to make laws. Let's say, for example, Citizenship Amendment Act. The year was 2019 when the parliament passed a law called Citizenship Amendment Act. According to this law, if you are from 6 religious minorities from 3 Islamic countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, you will be provided citizenship in India. Long story short, a law was passed in 2019 by the Parliament of India. According to this law, if anyone from 6 religious minorities, Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and if you have come from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, and if you have entered India on or before 31st December 2014, you are eligible for citizenship. This law was passed by the legislature. But in reality, who implements this law? In actual practice, which body is responsible for implementing the laws passed by the legislature? That body is what we call executive. But hereafter, look at me carefully. There is something called political executive, and then there is something called permanent executive. What is a political executive? Prime Minister and his ministers. They're part of the political executive. That means in 2014, we had Dr. Manmohan Singh as the Prime Minister and his ministers were there. 2014, this government was voted out of power and Mr. Modi was sworn in as the Prime Minister of this country. Remain in office till 2019. In 2019, again election was conducted and Mr. Modi won by a thumping majority. Again in 2024, another election will be conducted. That means members of the political executive, ministers, prime minister, deputy ministers, ministers of state, they are there for a temporary period, for 5 years. After 5 years, they have to again go to the public, ask for the votes, and if the public agrees with them, they will be voted back to power. These are political executive. But then we have permanent executive. And all of you are aspiring to be part of this permanent executive, bureaucrats, civil services, members of all India services, central services, state services. And if you become part of these services, you are part of the permanent executive. And it is this permanent executive which is basically responsible for day-to-day administration. So when CAA was passed, to implement CAA, we will have political executive making rules. And these rules then will be effectively implemented on the ground, day-to-day basis by this permanent executive. So what is an executive basically? Long story short, an executive is somebody, a group of people who are responsible for day-to-day administration, implementation of the policies laid down by the Parliament in actual practice. And if you need an even better definition of what is an executive, the better definition would be executive is often involved in framing of the policy. And it is this organ of the government which primarily looks after the function of implementation and administration. And this body is what we call as the executive. So what have we understood? Legislature, executive, judiciary. They are three important organs of the government. Now we will focus on executive. What is this executive? Executive is a body, a group of people who are responsible for implementing the policies. And these policies are laid down by the legislature. For example, in your university, there are rules which are made by the governing council. But these rules are effectively implemented by whom? By Vice Chancellor and his team. So Vice Chancellor and his team becomes the executive body which is responsible for implementing the decisions that are to be taken in the university to smoothly run the university on day-to-day basis. Similarly, for a large university such as India, for a large entity such as India, there will be laws laid down by the Parliament. But to implement these laws, we will have the executive. An executive will have permanent executive and political executive. These members of the political executive keep coming and going, depending upon the will of the people. But the permanent executive, they will remain there till their retirement. And in actuality, in reality, it is the members of this permanent executive which are responsible for day-to-day administration, which are responsible for implementing the laws that are passed by the Parliament. But at the same time, we also need to understand what are the different types of executive. And we can categorize different types of executive based on whether there is collective leadership or whether there is individual leadership. Individual leadership, for example, in United States of America, where we have the president of the United States of America. And in United States of America, they follow a presidential form of executive based on the concept of individual leadership. And the President of United States is very powerful. He is not only the head of the state, the President is also head of the government. And now you understand the difference between the state and the government. In case of a presidential executive, which is based on the concept of individual leadership, the president is not only the head of the state, he's also the head of the government. And he's very powerful. And his life is not dependent upon legislature. So what does that mean? Something that I told you before. In case of India, Prime Minister remains in office as long as he enjoys the majority in Lok Sabha. The moment Prime Minister loses majority in Lok Sabha, he is gone. And this kind of executive we also follow at the state level. For example, recently in case of Maharashtra, as long as Mr. Uddhav Thackeray commanded the majority of the Legislative Assembly, he was the Chief Minister. The moment Eknath Shinde rebelled, and along with him took a large number of MLAs supported by the BJP, that means Uddhav Thackeray lost his majority on the floor of the Legislative Assembly. And that is why he lost his government, he lost the power, and Mr. Shinde was appointed as the Chief Minister, because we follow same parliamentary system at the central level as well as in the states as well. But in case of presidential executive, President of United States is the head of the state as well as head of the government. And it is not, he's not worried whether his government is in the majority in the Parliament of United States or not. Because in case of United States, their parliament is bicameral. What do we mean by bicameralism? Bicameralism means two houses. They have two houses of the parliament. House of Representatives, which is the lower house, Senate, which is the upper house. So in case of United States of America, the president will remain in office for 4 years. That's the term of the president, regardless of the fact whether his government has the majority in House of Representatives or not. Doesn't matter. That means in presidential executive, president is very powerful and he has a security of tenure, in a sense that he remains in office even if his party to which he belongs does not have the majority on the floor of the legislature. But then we have a system of executive, a type of executive, which is based on collective leadership. In case of president, we have individual leadership, President Joe Biden. In case of parliamentary democracies, we have collective leadership, Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers, Prime Minister and her Council of Ministers. And in this parliamentary type of democracy, that the head of the government is the Prime Minister. But head of the state can be a president or can be a monarch. For example, in case of United Kingdom, the head of the state is the Queen. That is why we call Britain a constitutional monarchy. That means, is Britain a constitutional democracy? It is. Is Britain a democracy? It is. But is Britain a republic? No. Because what do we mean by republic? Head of the state is elected. In any political entity, if the head of the state is elected, we call it a republic. Head of the state of United States is elected by the people. So United States is a republic. Head of the state in case of Britain is the Queen, who enjoys that position because of hereditary. That means the head of the state is not elected. Head of the state is holding a hereditary position. But even then, Britain is democracy. Even then, Britain follows a constitution. That is why we say Britain is a case of constitutional monarchy. But India is a constitutional republic, a parliamentary republic, where the head of the state, Ms. Draupadi Murmu, elected by the people, although not directly, indirectly, we will discuss that, but elected by the people. That means India is a republic. So how many types of executives do we have? broadly two types, presidential and parliamentary. Presidential democracy or presidential executive is based on the concept of individual leadership. Parliamentary executive is based on the concept of collective leadership. In case of presidential executive, president is the head of the state as well as head of the government. In case of parliamentary executive, head of the state is the president or the monarch. But the head of the government is the prime minister, and his council of ministers are there to assist him. But then we also have something called a semi-presidential system. Can I tell you one example of this semi-presidential system? For example, in Sri Lanka. Now listen to me even more carefully. Even when you read NCERT books, you should also cross-check whether the content is updated or not, because there has been a change. For example, your NCERT book on this chapter, Executive, talks about something called a semi-presidential executive in Sri Lanka. The year was 1978, when the Constitution of Sri Lanka was amended and the system of executive presidency was introduced. What is this executive presidency? In Sri Lanka, they would have a president as well as the prime minister. President is also elected by the people, and this president appoints a prime minister as well. It may be possible that president and the prime minister may be from the same political party. It may also be possible that the president and the prime minister may be from different political parties as well. So this concept of executive presidency was introduced in Sri Lanka in 1978. So it is some kind of a semi-presidential. Because in this case, the president of Sri Lanka has powers as well, has enormous powers as well. But then, the year was 2015. 19th Amendment was made to the Sri Lankan Constitution. And according to this 19th Amendment, do you know what happened? Important powers of the president were snatched. And these powers were given back to the parliament. Important powers of the president were snatched. And these powers were given to the parliament. For example, before 2015, the president could have appointed members of the Election Commission, members of the Delimitation Commission, members of the Public Service Commission. Now these powers were snatched from the president, and these powers were given to a constitutional council, which consists of parliamentarians. So now Parliament exercises control after 2015 over appointments of key constitutional functionaries such as Election Commission, Delimitation Commission, Public Service Commission. This was 2015. Then came 2020. 20th Amendment was made to the Sri Lankan Constitution. And now, President was given even more powers. So the powers which were snatched from the president in 2015, now these powers were given back to the president in 2020. So President of Sri Lanka became even more powerful. And in fact, in 2020, the Sri Lankan Constitution was amended to ensure those with dual citizens can also contest elections. Dual citizens means you may be a citizen of Sri Lanka, but at the same time, you are the citizen of any other country. Even then, you are eligible to contest elections in Sri Lanka. This was 2020. But now, recently, 2022, 21st Amendment has been passed because, you know, a crisis is brewing in Sri Lanka. A financial crisis which led to the fall of the government in Sri Lanka. Acute financial crisis, acute economic downturn in Sri Lanka. And now in 2022, an amendment has been made, passed by the cabinet of Sri Lanka, under which this executive presidency will be stripped, which basically means the enormous powers which were given to the president will be snatched. And the president of Sri Lanka will now be a mere ceremonial figure. although these changes have not been implemented yet, but very soon these changes will be implemented in Sri Lanka. So there, they have a proposal. The constitutional amendment bill is passed by the cabinet, where they want to strip the president of Sri Lanka of his powers, and they want to reduce the position of the president of Sri Lanka to that of the Indian president, to that of the British Queen. Why? Because they don't want to give more powers to the president. They want to make parliament more powerful. Long story short, if we know what is executive, if we know what exactly is the role played by the executive, should we also not know what are the different types of executives? Yes. Based on individual leadership, president or presidential executive. Based on collective leadership, parliamentary executive. But then there also exists some form of a semi-presidential executive, where there is a president as well as the prime minister, but president also has more powers. President is not like a figurehead, ceremonial figure like Indian president. We will discuss Indian president very soon. Just like we have in France as well, semi-presidential system. And in case of Sri Lanka, we have the semi-presidential system, which will be revoked or changed into a parliamentary system very soon, because the 21st Amendment has been passed. Clear? Let's look at parliamentary executive in India. And the first question that should come to your mind is, why have we followed a parliamentary form of government in India? Why not a presidential form of government? And the answer is very simple. The makers of our constitution, they wanted to ensure that we have a strong executive. But at the same time, they were very concerned about some kind of a personality cult that gets developed when you have a presidential executive. They didn't want, the makers of our constitution, they did not want this personality cult to develop in India, to emerge in India. That is why they thought that since in a presidential executive, it is based on the concept of individual leadership, where an individual has the control over the policy making, where the individual has the control over the administration. Instead of this individual, which will lead to a personality cult being developed around this individual, we need to have collective leadership, where Prime Minister, along with his cabinet colleagues, along with his ministers, they will be collectively responsible to implement the laws, to run the government, to run the administration. So if the question is asked in your prelims examination, what is the reason why we have a parliamentary form of executive in India? The answer for that lies in NCRTs. And the NCRT tell us that there is always the danger of personality cult in presidential executive. And that is why the makers of Indian Constitution wanted a government which has a strong executive, but at the same time, enough safeguards should be there to check against the personality cult. And that is why the makers of Indian Constitution adopted a parliamentary executive in India. Clear? Now, in this parliamentary system in India, according to this concept of parliamentary democracy or parliamentary executive in India, we have a president who is the head of the state, not the head of the government, head of the state. But he is a mere ceremonial figure. He is a mere figurehead. Sir, what is figurehead? On paper, you might see, or it might